That is
Share screen. And then we're going to play from the current slide. Yes, yes, you may go. And Homer, your friend Ron Adler just joined.
Oh, great.
I'll introduce him at the end since we've already started. Okay, so thanks to Bob for this notice here. The Army Corps of Engineers knew what Trump would waste water, memo shows. So very, very interesting. Thanks for that, Bob. And then I thought this was highly amusing, just trying to keep our spirits up. When during his speech to Congress, he noticed that Doge had found $8 million that was making mice transgender. And he added, "This is real." Except it wasn't. He confused transgenic with transgender, or the Doge people did. And Heather Cox Richardson, God bless her, ferreted this out for her. This was actually a study. I don't know who was turned into what, but at the next session to Congress, they'll talk about turning orange mice into black mice. I don't know. Okay. And then just the Keystone Cops, the Department of Transportation, complaining they need traffic controllers, and multiple plane crashes, and Musk is making his job harder. So that's one thing. But it really hit the point with a challenge to Marco Rubio when a couple of Doge staffers cut off HIV treatment to Africa. That was George W. Bush's project, you'll remember. And it came to a head, and Congress spoke out. And it caused Trump to call a cabinet meeting, and there was a big face-off in the cabinet meeting. And so Musk got his comeuppance, which made Steve Bannon happy. Talk about Schadenfreude, and they're really going at each other. But the interesting thing, where he made this statement, where was Bannon when he made this statement? He just pled guilty to a felony count of defrauding donors during the first term, who donated to his Build a Wall project. Anyway, Bannon gloated, and Trump, during the meeting, openly sided with Rubio, pointing out to Musk, "You're a consultant advisor. You have to go to the cabinet heads." And then he added, "I don't want a hatchet. I want a scalpel." So a takedown of Musk, we've been waiting for it. And then there was this Trump shaking hands with Amy Coney Barrett, and Barrett, I'm sorry. And what the Supreme Court didn't tell Trump is they had just decided against him in a 5-4 majority just hours before he's shaking their hand. But they postponed announcing it until after the speech. And so the Supreme Court unfroze $2 billion in foreign aid. It's apparently for work already done. So it's a low bar. Don't get your hopes up. But there was that. And then what does MAGA do? Well, in my home state, they started a movement ditch Amy Coney Barrett from the Supreme Court, calling her a DEI hire. Um, it was interesting. They didn't call Roberts, who voted with her, a DEI hire. Maybe because he's a white man. I don't know. But then they went for the jugular. They thought they really got Amy Coney Barrett when she had arranged to play Hamilton songs to a welcome party for Ketanji Brown when Ketanji Brown joined the Supreme Court. So very silly stuff. More seriously, Silicon Valley libertarianism has just gone off the rails, and Peter Thiel, who's one of them in Silicon Valley, he bankrolled J.D. Vance. But it was interesting, and Ramsey distributed this around. Our local newspaper printed a story about the inequality in Silicon Valley and how extreme it is. And you take the nine richest billionaires, and their combined wealth is more than or 15 times the wealth of the bottom half of the people that live in Silicon Valley, represented by this very thin wafer of wealth. So you have that. And then incomes have been going up for everybody in Silicon Valley, but more for whites than Asians, African Americans. And then you look at this was an interesting measure of inequality, where the higher the position on the graph, the more unequal you are, and you're going way up in Silicon Valley. And this is the United States as a whole, this measure of inequality. Note that California is just a little bit below the United States. So California has, as a whole, has the same kind of inequality problem. So, and then this was in the newspapers. These are vehicles, people living in these RVs. And they're parking in a shoreline in the shadow of Google. So there's a little bit of a metaphor there. Medicaid, we're all holding our breath on Medicaid. It's about the only thing they can cut that will put a dent in the deficit. And they're denying that they're going to do it. Oh no, there's enough waste, fraud, and abuse. We won't have to cut important programs. But there are moderate Republicans, like this Republican from the Central Valley, where the majority of their constituents are on Medicaid. So 60%. And probably a lot of them are Latinos. And there are at least 10 other moderate Republicans that are from competitive districts where cuts to Medicaid would push them out of Congress with the next election. So even some senators are echoing House moderates. And here's Josh Hawley. We remember him. And on a different argument is Rand Paul, named after Ayn Rand, by the way. And he is upset about the $10 trillion increase in the debt ceiling, which they're going to be voting on, I think, this week. Okay, so last week we got through at least a few decades of U.S. history, looking at it in the context of Trump, and trying to answer the question: why did the majority, well, a plurality of Americans vote for Trump? A guy like that, how could he even get 30% of the vote? But as we go back through American history, we're trying to look at key moments to answer that question. And we've been focusing on our borders and the immigrants. And I'm going to get to the point, I hope, today where I can make the case that we can call Trump a sovereigntist, a sovereigntist. I don't want to jump ahead. I want to build up my case for this slowly. So you remember last week we talked about the expansion of America, starting with George Washington, who accumulated a lot of land in the Ohio Valley from being a surveyor. That's how they were paid, but also as a colonel in the British Army, and he was paid with titles to strips of land in the Ohio Valley. So when he died, he was the richest man in America on paper. And then we touched a little bit about immigrants, and of course in Hamilton, the famous song "Immigrants." We get the job done after Hamilton is finally allowed to lead a battalion at Yorktown. And then we talked a little bit about the American history. We've always rooted for the freedom fighters, and the first one was this Polish patriot who did a lot of work at West Point, including building the chain that went across the Hudson River to keep the British ships from going up the river. We talked a little bit about the Mississippi River, and how the Mississippi River was one of Jefferson's key reasons for doing the Louisiana Purchase. It was against the Constitution at the time, and it was against some of his own sentiments for the small farmer. But he pulled the trigger because of the Mississippi River, and it had bounced back and forth and control. Who was controlling it? The French were the first Europeans, so they controlled it until the 7 Years' War. And then it amazingly went under Spanish control, and we studied that map last week, how Spain controlled all this territory. But then France, under Napoleon, somehow clawed it back, and he sold it to the United States. But the British weren't done. They figured that the Mississippi was the soft underbelly. And so in the War of 1812, which was mostly taking place and fighting over Canada, they decided to try to go north through the soft underbelly at New Orleans. And of course, we remember how Andrew Jackson defeated them decisively, and the casualties were astounding. Only 62 American casualties versus over 2,000 British casualties in 30 minutes, because he had completely outfoxed them, laid a trap, and they didn't have ladders to get over his final battlement. So then we talked a little bit about the frontier thesis. How could somebody like Jackson defeat the British Army? And he used his wile, and he put together an unlikely coalition. But the question came up, well, wait a minute. Frederick Jackson Turner, Jim Teisel pointed this out. And we asked the question last week, does this middle name come from Andrew Jackson? And Turner himself started off in Wisconsin. He wasn't from Tennessee or anything. He went to the University of Wisconsin, wound up at Harvard, and that's where his frontier thesis became so famous. But the answer is yes. His mother was a descendant from the Jackson family, so he was named after his mother. Turner's thesis, of course, is that the frontier, including Andrew Jackson specifically, played a large role in developing our national character, and probably a clue into why we vote the way we do today. We'll see. And what was this motley crew that Jackson had put together? A coalition of pirates, men of color, free and liberated, Native Americans, state militias, and only 17% of his army was regular army. Quite an achievement. We ended last week talking about, now that the Mississippi's was open, it was going to be open to Europeans fleeing Europe, and a few decades later, the Mississippi Chinese, which Aiko and I are interested in because our daughter-in-law is descended from the Mississippi Chinese. Now, that wasn't until after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And the sentiment for that, of course, started right here in California, right here in the Bay Area, to our shame. But back to the Mississippi, let's talk about that. Okay, you all know I like to go on tangents, and I think the history of the Mississippi is interesting. We can't just skip over what happened to the Mississippi before the French came. And the interesting thing about the Mississippi is there was probably contact across the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, I'm still using the word Mexico. And some contact between the cultures of Mesoamerica, which was also a river culture. So right here at the waist, this isthmus, this is an early river culture, the Olmecs. We'll get to the Toltecs in just a second, but they're the ones came a little bit north. It's easy to believe that there was contact between this river culture and this river culture, either sailing across or hugging the shore. So it's not far-fetched at all. And this history is fascinating. So this is the Olmec civilization that begins at the isthmus there. And it's one of the first civilizations of the world, 1400 BCE. Remember the river civilization? So the Olmecs is a river civilization, just like the Nile and the Euphrates and the Indus and the Yellow River that were the places most conducive to starting early civilizations. So this isthmus, here's the river, and this was Olmec actually meant rubber. So the earliest ball games that are associated with these cultures, most famously at Chichen Itza, started here. So the Toltecs, they were a little bit further north. They conquered Chichen Itza, and their influence spread over a wide area. Um, and they were a warrior culture, but they traded, and there's evidence that they traded as far north as Chaco Canyon, which is in New Mexico. But also along the Mississippi. And they had a myth of a leader who, at the end of their empire, left to find some mysterious place across the sea to the east. Could that have been the Mississippi? But independently on the Mississippi, there were mound builders that reached their peak these centuries here. And you can still climb these mounds at a few places along the Mississippi, which Aiko and I did. And there is evidence that show that Toltec influence in the arts from copper plates that have been dug up by archaeologists. And then this leader that disappeared to the east, he morphed into a god. Quetzalcoatl is the Aztec legend. And the Aztecs, some of them believed when Cortez showed up that he was Quetzalcoatl. But all that had its roots in the Toltec society. Mississippi during the Olmecs time, much earlier, there's a archaeological Poverty Point, and so much has been found there that it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Amazing. So there's only 24 UNESCO heritage sites in America, and this is the Cahokia is one of them. Here's Chaco Canyon, which I just talked about before. When we were lived on the reservation for 2 years, we were not far from Grand Canyon, so we had a chance to go to Mesa Verde and the Taos Pueblo as well. Mississippi Mounds, a little bit a darker story, evidence of a mass sacrifice of 53 young women. We certainly saw that with the Aztecs and probably the Mayans too, human sacrifice. Corn, beans, and squash were grown together, and that was an innovation from the Mayan. They all mutually support each other. We don't have time to go into those details. So back to general immigration, end of tangent. So back to general immigration, let's start around 1820. There was a mini wave of immigration that mainly generated by the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. And then from Germans seeking political unrest from Metternich. And of course, the completion of the Erie Canal opened up the West and further to the north. But Metternich, he played a minor role. For those of us that were interested in the Habsburgs and the series on Netflix called The Empress, at the very end of his reign is when that miniseries starts. And he had organized all the kings against Napoleon and finally defeated him at Waterloo. And he set up a system that set up a balance of powers. Metternich was studied intensively by Henry Kissinger. He wrote his PhD thesis on the balance of power. And that was part of his motive for cozying up to Russia, to China, excuse me, to pry them away from Russia. And this was a famous Congress where Metternich, standing here, got such famous people as the Duke of Wellington over here leaning against the wall, Talleyrand, the French leader, and put together this a balance of power in Europe. And arguably, it kind of lasted almost all the way to World War I, with a couple of major hiccups along the way. But he set up really a police state, at least in Habsburg, Austria. And that you saw that play out in The Empress, in that series on the Habsburgs. So he kept a pretty tight lid, and then there was and suppressed the sentiments for nationalism that Napoleon had loosened. And finally, in the revolutions of 1848, it all comes tumbling down, and the Habsburg Empire, which is quite amazing when you look. We could spend a half hour just talking about how extensive it was. But it all came apart, and they had to really start drafting people into the army to keep public order. And it was this draft system that caused a lot of Europeans to flee. So that's the punchline for me explaining all this. And this was true across Europe. So the French had a draft as well. The emperor, the new emperor of France, had a draft, and that's I talked last week about the immigrants from Alsace-Lorraine, and that's why they fled to America and went up the Mississippi. That was the second wave of Jewish immigrants. So I'm starting in the middle with the story of Jewish immigrants. I told you last week that it was the Jewish immigrants, in particular from Alsace-Lorraine, that went up the Mississippi. And they were mostly Germans fleeing the draft. And this second wave of Jews became the successful merchants and bankers that evolved in the 1880s. Very different than the third wave. But what was the first wave? So now we go way back in just a second. And just finished the point on the Jews from Alsace-Lorraine that went up the Mississippi. And they started general stores, became very successful. One of them was so successful that he became Secretary of State for the Confederacy. And when the Confederates lost, he immigrated to Britain and became a member of Parliament. So pretty successful guy. I told you last week how Aiko and I visited this Jewish summer camp near Vicksburg, where they had the exhibition on Alsace, Lorraine. So now the first wave. I'm rewinding all the way back to 1650. So the first wave of Jewish immigrants to New York, or New Amsterdam, as it was called. So that's the clue. Amsterdam. They were Jews that had immigrated to Holland. And then they joined Dutch explorers who went to Brazil. And from Brazil, the Dutch got into a war with the Portuguese, who kicked them out of Brazil, and that's when the Jews from Brazil
Hmm.
went to New Amsterdam, and they dominated Jewish life until the 19th century, when they yielded to the second German wave. Now, these Jews were Sephardic, and I can't resist just explaining what Sephardic is. So here's a tangent. Sephardic Jews were from North Africa. The fall of Rome, the Jews had spread out across North Africa. And when Muhammad took over with Islam, the Islamic dynasty conquered Spain, and they brought with them Jewish supporters who did administration for the Moors in Spain. And so they lived there and prospered. There was a golden age of Spain in Cordoba, the golden age, and the Jews were a big part of that. And then when Ferdinand and Isabella came to the throne, there was an inquisition, and the Jews either converted to Christianity, or they left, and so there was a diaspora of Sephardic Jews that went back to Africa, but some went to Holland. And so these are the Sephardic Jews that then went from Holland with the Dutch explorers to Brazil. Sephardic Jews also spread throughout the Middle East. But there was a group of German Jews that went up the Rhine. And when we were in Berlin, we went to the new Jewish museum there. There was a whole section on talking about how Jews came up the Rhine with the Romans. And so here's a reference for that, which I found very interesting. So all along the Rhine, there were Jewish ghettos. So these are the Sephardic Jews that made it to New Amsterdam, welcomed by Peter Stuyvesant, and they came specifically from Recife. The R is silent. Recife, which Aiko and I visited when Tim was, our youngest son, was working down there. And when we were there, we happened to overlap with a convention of Jews from all over South America who'd come to celebrate the rededication of a synagogue in Recife, because that was the location of the first synagogue in the New World. And so this is the new synagogue that they were dedicating when we were there. But underneath, you go in, and they have laminated plastic floors that you can look through and see the original foundation of the first synagogue in the New World. Built on the Rua de Uden, but that had been rechristened Rua de Bom Jesus. But when we were there, it was dedicated, and then Brazil, being Brazil, It was a Sunday, and there was always dancing in the streets in Recife Old Town. And so that particular night, they were doing Israeli folk dances. Um, so a Sephardic synagogue. We also went into a Sephardic synagogue in, of all places, Budapest. And it was among the largest synagogue in the world. And it being Budapest, the synagogue was right next to the Jewish ghetto. And a lot of bad things were happening in the Jewish ghettos throughout Europe. So a lot of them from the neighboring ghetto went into this big synagogue as a sanctuary. And the Allies avoided bombing any place near a Jewish synagogue. So this synagogue was spared. But the Nazis capitalized on that, and the Gestapo put their headquarters in the balcony of this Sephardic synagogue. So this begs the question, what's a Sephardic synagogue doing in an Ashkenaz community? And in the 19th century, there was a tremendous interest in the Oriental architect style, exotic style. There are some movie theaters that you've been in that reflect this. And this was all laid out in this wonderful history of American foreign policy, starting with Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates, called Power, Faith, and Fantasy. And the fantasy part was describes in detail in the middle of the 19th century and the end of the century the fascination with the exotic art and architecture of the Middle East. And this was a famous dancer, Little Egypt. When we were, some of us were teenagers, we remember the hit song, I think it was by the Coasters, Little Egypt. Yeah, well, they're humming it here in studio. And so this was the Columbia Exposition in Chicago was a big part of describing this phenomenon. But if you go into a theater, like, say, the local Orinda Theater, you see some of this intricate design. There is an Egyptian theater in Los Angeles that shows that, and apparently I didn't get pictures of the interior of the Fox Theater in San Francisco, but apparently it shows this kind of eclectic design that mushes together Gothic, Moorish, and Renaissance art. But why movie houses? Well, you're trying to get your audience into a mood for fantasy, and there you are. It also explains such a phenomenon as in silent movies. Rudolph Valentino, he was a star from the exotic Middle East. And this song, one of my buddies in high school, his father was a band leader, so he sang that song for us. It's also featured in The Great Gatsby, this song. And this will be the end of the tangent. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Who spearheaded the renovation of the Great Synagogue after the fall of communism in Budapest?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Aren't you going to bring up who paid for it?
There you go. Believe it or not, Tony Curtis. So Tony Curtis, his father was a fundraiser for a synagogue in New York, And in honor of his father, he raised a lot of funds to renovate this synagogue. You can imagine it wasn't in too good shape after World War II and neglect by the communists. And so he got the Hungarian government to agree to match whatever he would raise so that they could renovate
He was Jewish.
Huh?
Yeah.
He was Jewish, Tony Curtis.
Yeah, Tony Curtis was Jewish.
Okay.
This place is absolutely gorgeous.
Absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful places we've been at. So then this sets up the third wave of Jewish immigrants, and they were not from Sephardic North Africa, nor were they from Germany, but they were from Eastern Europe. And they started coming out very heavily in the 1880s and continued until the 1940s, pushed out by persecution, pogroms, poverty. 3 million, and mostly settled on the East Coast, but famously a wave of them went and were part of the establishment of Hollywood. And when we get to doing California history seriously, we'll have a couple of weeks talking about the development of Hollywood and the Jewish influence in Hollywood. And of course, that wave was cut off in the 1920s. But part of that wave, I'm reading this biography of Mel Brooks at bedtime so I can get to sleep after all the bad news that we're absorbing. And you get the story of his family that was in this third wave. And of course, the survivors that made it to America early on were lucky, because those that didn't, his relatives that didn't immigrate before 1920 disappeared for the most part. So Ellis Island, it was first opened as an immigration station, kind of informal, would process Northern Europe, Europeans fleeing political unrest. But immigration was mostly unmonitored until around 1891, when Ellis Island was really built up and to accommodate the third wave of Jewish immigrants, but all the other immigrants as well, which totaled 12 million going up until the 1920s. Of course, on the West Coast, I don't want to leave out the history of California, you have Angel Island, and Iko's mother came in through Angel Island.
No, grandmother.
A grandmother, thank you. But your mother, didn't she, when she went over to Japan for high school, when she came back, didn't she go through Angel
She
Island?
might have done that coming back.
I think she did. And so there was a play also that we went to early. I think I've talked about it previously, about Chinese immigrants that had to come through Angel Island. And the medical exam, we have a few physicians in the audience. So they didn't start really until around 1910. The medical exam only rejected 6% of immigrants for what? Lameness, trachoma, heart problems, pregnancy, mental illness. And if you didn't pass this initial screening, and you can see the doctor there checking for trachoma, which I had to learn to do on the Navajo reservation because they suffered from trachoma, the desert being a setup for trachoma. And so Angel Island, though, they were more exacting, and they rejected up to a third of immigrants, which gets me. I just couldn't resist. What's the history of international sanitation? When does that start? And it's really 1851 is the first international conference. And so there'd been some epidemics. I mean, there's been epidemics throughout human history, but the epidemics that got the attention in the middle of the 1800s was the cholera epidemic in Mecca. And when you think about it, people coming from all over the world crammed together to go into Mecca, to go in and file past the Kaaba and kiss the magic black stone that's there. And there's been other epidemics. There was a measles epidemic, I think, fairly recently. And the reason for that, I think, is that immigrants from Pakistan had been subject to a rumor that the measles vaccine was a form of American biological warfare. And they had resisted it, and I think they were the ones that started the recent measles epidemic. Of course, we've had measles epidemics in this country, one in Texas now, but previously there was one at Disneyland 10 years ago. But also various waves of influenza. 1830 was a bad one, 1847 was a bad one, and of course, at the end of World War I, 1917, the Spanish flu. The other diseases, you don't see much anymore, but plague and yellow fever. And the United States, though, didn't attend this, and they didn't start attending until 1881. How are we doing for time?
Minutes.
Huh?
5 minutes.
So these are the countries that participated. Sardinia is really the name that Turin, when we were talking about Italian unification, two Sicilies was part of that story as well. And so we didn't send a doctor and a diplomat until the 1880s. By the way, quarantine during the plague, arbitrarily, city fathers decided that any ship coming into an Italian harbor had to wait 40 days to make sure there wasn't plague incubating on board. So from the Italian word 40 days, which is quaranta giorni, and this became quarantine. So back to the story of American expansion. Sorry for the tangent. Jackson, of course, deported during his presidency. He was second generation Scots-Irish, by the way. So he wasn't deporting Europeans. He was deporting American Indians, the Spanish, and Seminoles first in Florida, and then this Trail of Tears, which we talked about briefly before, where Jackson defied the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had said and ruled that Georgia had no right to Cherokee land, and that Georgia couldn't force Cherokees out of Georgia. And Jackson, as president, is supposed to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court. But he was sympathetic to Georgians, being an Indian fighter, and he said, okay, John Marshall has decided to let him enforce it. And we talked about this before. So it's not something that Jackson did, it's something he didn't do. So what can we learn about Trump from his favorite president? This is interesting. They're similar in a couple of striking ways. They have both been in a rage over being denied the presidency. And both of them in power had grandiose ambitions, but because of intemperateness, failed to achieve what they wanted to achieve. And in this regard, Jackson was intemperate before he was president. He had a quick trigger on military executions to enforce military discipline. And he was a slave owner, and at least one of his slaves died at the hands of his slave master, which became an issue in his run for the presidency. So on a lighter note, Trump also had a connection with Navajo code talkers. So he invited them into the White House, and he used the occasion for his Pocahontas jab at Elizabeth Warren, which one of the guests thought was out of bounds, uncalled for. But I have to point out that Navajos voted for Trump 51 to 45% this time. Yeah. And so they were part of this swing to Trump that included some African American men and Spanish American men. And so you have to take that into account. So I'm going to go on a little tangent here, and this will be where we'll end. The Navajos came from Alaska. They're Athabascan. Now, the Inuit are a little bit different ethnicity, so they're not the same ethnicity. But the Navajos left and wandered down and got to the Southwest about the same time that the Spanish came up, as we've been discussing in California. And I'm going to make a prediction based on a podcast I heard this morning about Greenland. And within that conversation, they mentioned, I think, a model for the way Greenland is going to be decided, which is Kwajalein. Now, this isn't Kwajalein, but this is very similar. There are atolls sprinkled throughout the Pacific, which are basically just the land that's left after a volcano blows. America has what's called a free association with Kwajalein, which is part of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And so they allow us to land planes there and do military tests there. I think there were some atomic tests there. Not right at Kwajalein, but Kwajalein was the base for them, in which these people receive an awful lot of financial assistance. And I think that is probably going to be an interesting model. Trump most recently has said some nice things about the natives of Greenland. So I think he is trying to win them with carrots. And he said they have a right to determine their future, but he adds menacingly, one way or the other, we're going to get it. But this, if you want to run this down, this is from this journalist Jeffrey Gettleman, and we had been made receptive to this by one of Bob's recommendations on the miniseries Borgen about a Danish woman prime minister. And we got far enough into Borgen that in the first season, episode 4, Greenland's part of that, and Borgen travels to Greenland, so and gets exposed to the real issues, a lot of social issues, which were pretty much the same social issues that Iko and I encountered on the Navajo reservation. But apparently in season 4, Borgen becomes the foreign minister and manages the Arctic crisis. So that's probably a place to end. I'll just do this what if slide. So this is looking down on the North Pole, and the pink is where the Inuits live. And 57,000 live in Greenland. I think 70,000 live in Canada. And of course, some of them live in Alaska. But look at this. Some of them live in Russia. And so here's a larger question. What if these people decide to bond together as one nation of 125,000 people, half the population of Iceland, and all vote to declare their independence? They already have a council, and here's their last council meeting in a high school gym somewhere near Barrow. The mascot is the Barrow Whalers. But you have the flags strung together of all the countries that they live in. And the journalist attending this witnessed this was like a reunion of, say, your college or high school, where people were embracing and saying hello to friends they haven't seen in a while. Okay, so Jackson's legacy and mindset will take up, and I'll just give you a brief tease here. James Polk. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about James Polk next week, and he carried out Jackson's dream. All right, so I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions, comments.
Wow. And I want you to stop. I'm ready to hear in the next chapter.
Well,
I have a question about the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War.
yeah.
And you said that the Ellis Island people were stopped ladies because they were pregnant.
Yeah.
So the 14th Amendment says you can get to America, and if you give birth, you are a citizen.
Right.
So was this to keep them from becoming a citizen, that they stopped them because they were pregnant?
No, I don't think so. I think a lot of it was is this going to make this person dependent, and I don't know the details of that answer, but I think the question in the medical examiner's mind is this going to cost the country more to have this person? I mean, some of it too was like trachoma was to stop the spread of trachoma, so to treat them and do that. But I don't think so.
Okay.
Because that really didn't become an issue until much later. Okay.
Hey, John, I got one name for you.
Okay.
Semmelweis.
Yeah.
Semmelweis,
Yes.
right? People may know, but he was really the first guy who figured out that if they went from, a dead person, corpse, to then deliver a baby, which was common in Vienna in the 1840s, 30s, he noticed the infectious rate. And he's really the founder of hand washing. And some would argue one of the originators of the whole concept of public health, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things that Habsburg's Austria, Vienna gave to the medical world. Yes.
I think the interesting thing on this New York Times podcast this morning was the kind of sense that Greenlanders are looking for some separation from Denmark. Feeling they've been given the bad end of the bargain and discrimination and everything else over the years, so that some semblance of a vote coming out next week might indicate that. I think it's next week that various parties are getting together. So there may be something happening out of all this Greenland discussion. And again, that the reporter today was advocating, or basically saying that the association model might actually work.
Yeah, and I think the reason I mentioned Borgland is you get a sense of the frustrations that are inevitable between the colonial power. Now, they had been released as a colony in the early 50s, but they're still just resentment. No matter if you had run an exemplary policy, just their relationship has created a lot of resentment. Yeah.
Hey, that brings up an interesting idea. Musk could give each of the Greenlanders $1 million, and it would only be a quarter of what he currently has, and that's after he's lost 50% in the last 2 months. For $58 billion, he could buy Greenland, and then he wouldn't have to go to Mars, and he could he could charge Trump to import all the Gazans to do the mining up there. I mean, we can solve the world problem right here.
Well, very good. David, write a letter to the editor.
Thank you, Bill, for laughing.
Proposal.
It's better than crying.
So, John.
Yeah.
It's Borgen, not Borgland, and Borgen is actually the name of the Danish Parliament. It's not the Prime Minister's name at all. It's the name of the Parliament.
Right. Yeah.
And one other thing, speaking of Elon, he used to, when he was starting SpaceX, a lot of the first launches were from Kwajalein, and then it got too expensive to keep going down there and launching rockets, so he found another spot in Texas.
Oh, really? Huh.
Almost.
Interesting.
Well, I think 3 strikes are out. If his third big rocket blows up, the stock's going to disappear.
Right? Well, actually, he had 3 blow up, and he just rolled the dice one more time, and the 4th one worked. He's had a pretty good success rate when you count up all the launches.
Well, I think he had like 27 failures initially, though. I mean, he had a lot of failures as he was building out the first.
Well, depending on what you call a failure, but I was listening to his biography when I did a road trip last month, and basically what the biographer was saying, it was the first 3 didn't make it, but the 4th one was his last shot. He was going to run out of money if the 4th one didn't make it, and it made it.
We'll find out when he substitutes Starlink for the air traffic controllers.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of balls in the air. And he's got a lot of balls.
Yeah, I was going to say, are they his balls or somebody else's balls?
Was that the Walter Isaacson biography?
I'm not sure. Probably, but I don't think there's been that many biographies so far.
Well, Walter Isaacson, he was interviewed. He's done biographies of Steve Jobs and a lot of people, and he said that that Musk was the most open to him. That he would sit down with him day or night and shoot the breeze and was very transparent.
That sounds like the guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back to Medicaid for a minute. The vote today, I haven't heard whether it's happened yet, is on the continuing resolution, which postpones, or actually continues the continuing resolution budget until September 30th, and it includes postponing the dish cuts for public hospitals. It also includes extending the telehealth flexibilities that are there, and there's actually no particular cuts actually in this particular bill. So we'll see what happens between now and the 30th.
Excellent. Good news. We need good news. Any other good news?
Actually, it's interesting in talking about Greenland is that I have a neighbor that was in let's see, it would be the mid 60s, like many of us are, or that we remember it anyway. And he was stationed at Camp Century in Greenland. And that was where basically they had a nuclear reactor, and they were trying to figure out ways in order to get, to keep send rockets to Russia, and kind of as the Cold War. And but it was very interesting about the amount of money that they poured into Greenland in order to make this camp, and all of this underground tunnels and it was a pretty remarkable story. And there's a National Geographic focused on it in last month's articles on Camp Century, and the fact that it just became so the ice there was just so always dramatic and moving and changing, and it was just too impossible to upkeep the base. So basically, in 1969, they basically abandoned it. I think it was only up from 56 to 69.
Yeah.
There's still a base.
I've heard the effort, the engineering, the expense, number of people involved in constructing that base was compared at one time to the effort of building the Panama Canal.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's well located. It can monitor that gap, naval gap, right, in the submarines, and it can monitor the rocket flyway between Russia and America. So it's strategic. There's no doubt about it. And
Hey, what happened? What happened to Trump cutting the military budget 8% every year? Is there anybody following that? Because
Yeah.
one of the arguments would be just get rid of the missiles and get rid of the subs, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it so much. But
I think the continuing resolution increases military budget by $6 billion.
right, I think that's right. That's right, Homer. You're right.
Non-valuable personnel.
yeah, the news is moving awfully fast. By the time I'm done in the morning, there's 3 or 4 breaking stories.
Exciting. Well, thanks for keeping track of it all, John.
Yep. Good deal.
Yeah, you and Rachel Maddow.
Right.
Take care.
See y'all next week.
This person needs to get the camera focused.
Huh?
You might remind this person down here to.
Carol.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Your camera's never on your